This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon and welcome to the first CAS webinar of the 2019-2020 season. My name is Allison Del Calzo-Behrens and I'm an HIV counselor at the Family Health Center of Morristown Medical Center and the chair of the Morris County Community Assistance Services Committee. Today's webinar is about trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care has become the best practice standard across all service programs but can be applied to any setting. Before we start, there are a few housekeeping items I would like to review. First, this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the CAS YouTube channel. Number two, everyone is being muted, but questions and comments are welcome. Just go ahead and enter them into the chat. And lastly, so that I can have an accurate attendance record, if you did not use your name upon logging in, or if you haven't connected to the audio with a PIN number, please enter your name into the chat, and I'll go ahead and write that down. So I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Stephanie Klotz, Professional Training Manager at JBWS.
Hi, thanks so much, Allison. So I am really excited to talk to you guys about trauma-informed care because I think it really has reshaped the way that we are partnering with survivors and the way that we're framing this issue within our agencies. And so I think the more agencies countywide that are utilizing this approach, the more likely we all are to kind of be working with folks to heal their trauma instead of accidentally perhaps re-traumatizing them. So I want to invite you all to join the conversation. We just got Poll Everywhere at our agency, and so throughout this training, you'll have the opportunity to have your answers be part of some live polling and things like that. So you have two ways that you can do that. You can go to pollas.com/JBWSDV agency 999, or if you have your cell phone available, you can text JBWSDV agency 999 to the number 22333. So 22333 is the recipient, and then the message is JBWSDV agency 999. That information will be available again as those polls are going up, but sometimes it's easier for people to just get linked in right as they're first connecting. So today, as we're talking about trauma-informed care, we're going to first identify what does that mean, what are the principles and values that drive that, and with that, it's really critical that we understand what trauma is, how the brain responds to that, and the impact that that is having on individuals. And then we're also, of course, going to take a look at how you might implement this information into your agency to be more trauma-informed across the board. And what's really interesting with that is that we're really going to be looking at parallel process for both staff and clients when we're talking about this trauma-informed agency approach. So to start off, I want to kind of just go over the principles, right? These core values of trauma-informed care. And of course, number one is safety, right? We couldn't do anything with a trauma survivor if they're not feeling safe. So we want to make sure that our spaces are safe, where people are feeling culturally, emotionally, and physically safe, and that we're kind of aware of what discomfort looks like, right? If someone isn't safe, how can we identify that and really work to make sure that they do feel safe? We also look at transparency and trustworthiness. So this is looking at really just providing information about what's likely to happen and what's happening now. Certainly having a lack of information is scary, right? The fear of the unknown. So through transparency, we're able to really help be the most supportive of people that have had trauma. When we're talking about peer support, we're looking at the opportunity for trauma victims to support each other, but also staff to support each other, and really a collaboration across both survivors and those working with them that is supportive in nature. When we look at collaboration and mutuality, that's kind of looking at the idea that healing happens within a relationship. And that relationship needs to have shared decision making. And we need to really acknowledge that there is a power differential between staff and client and work hard to erase that. The same thing would go for different organizational staff that are at different levels. How do we make sure that we're consciously working to ensure that people are on a level playing field, that everyone's voice matters? And that leads us to our next point, which is empowerment, choice, and voice. Every individual deserves dignity. Every individual has strengths. And in this type of approach, we're building on those strengths and validating them. And that is including kind of giving voice back to staff and the clients that we're serving, and making sure that we're not doing for someone, but really working in a partnership with them. And finally, this last piece, this cultural, historical, and gender issues component, is one of the more recent principles to be kind of added in. And some of the materials that you'll find in my reference and resources have the first 5 principles, but not this cultural and historical piece. And that's really where we're looking to actively move past stereotypes and biases. We want to incorporate policy and protocol that are responsive to racial, ethnic, and cultural needs of the individual served. So that is also critical, right? We can't understand someone's trauma without also understanding the cultural, historical, and gender issues that are related to that. Having just a hard time getting to the next slide. Okay, there we go. So those are the 4 principles. And then when we look at what does that mean, right? How do we understand when an agency is trauma informed? That's when we look at the 4 R's. So realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand the path for recovery. Recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma. Respond by fully integrating that knowledge and seeking to actively resist re-traumatization. So that's really the most important part. I know what it looks like, I can identify it, and then how can I make sure that everything that I'm doing, that my agency is doing, is really working hard to not re-traumatize? Certainly we're all in the helping field. No one enters this field thinking, I really want to hurt people more that have been traumatized. That being said, sometimes our policies, procedures, the way things that we have always done, traditionally done things, through this new framework just needs a closer look, right? And to look at what's the value of this? Is it re-traumatizing to our clients? And is there a way that we can adjust that? So I'm going to start with realizing the widespread impact. So when we look at this, we have to know, well, what is trauma? So when we talk about the definition of trauma, according to SAMHSA, it's an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that are experienced by an individual as harmful or life-threatening. And that's really critical because not everyone is going to have the same experience, right? So if all of us experienced a trauma right now, we might all have different responses to it. And some of us may feel that we are being harmed or that our life is in danger, and some of us may not, right? 2 children in the same home could experience the same trauma and not be impacted by it in the same way. So when I'm saying that, for me, it's really critical to remember that when someone identifies that something was traumatizing to them, that's all that matters, right? Is because it's that person's perception of the event as traumatizing, not necessarily us as an outside person saying, well, that doesn't sound traumatizing to me. So that's just a kind of a little bit of a nuance. So I want to give you guys a chance to participate. What are some traumatic events? So list different events or occurrences that someone might identify as traumatic. And I think you can respond up to 5 times. So feel free to respond more than once. We'll give a couple minutes for people to put in their answers. So we've got one in the chat box, death in family. Are you guys connected to the poll everywhere? You can text JBWS DV Agency 999 to the number 22333, and then it'll come up on the slide in a word cloud. If you don't have access to that, I can keep reading them out here in the chat. So watching parents in domestic violence, great. That would be another example of a traumatic event. Doesn't have to necessarily happen to me, but witnessing someone having a traumatic event would be considered a trauma for sure. Bullying, absolutely. Others might be a, oh my gosh, I just forgot the word for it. Like a weather incident, right? A hurricane, a natural disaster could be a trauma. It could be a sexual assault or domestic violence. Homelessness is considered a trauma. When we look at people that are navigating an HIV diagnosis, just receiving that diagnosis could be a trauma. So lots of different types of trauma, car accidents that someone could experience. When we think about all the different types of trauma, they're not all the same. So an acute trauma is a single event that's limited in time. And so that would be something like a car accident or perhaps a natural disaster, right? It's a single event. That meaning that you don't get in a car accident on the way to work and then be thinking about the car accident the whole day at work, thinking about getting in a car accident on the way home. A chronic trauma is multiple and varied events. And complex trauma is when you're exposed to this chronic trauma for such a long time that there's both an immediate and a long-term impact. So for example, domestic violence potentially would lead to homelessness. Both of those are chronic traumas and complex in nature. So on our next slide, you can text in, I don't know, maybe people will skip through the poll everywhere event. Really the idea here is that under this definition, everyone has experienced trauma, right? If you think about loss of a family member or a pet or a car accident or a natural disaster, everyone in the world has experienced a traumatic event. So 100% really of the population. And so if you think about that, right, having a trauma-informed approach benefits everyone. Not everyone may have complex trauma, right, this long-term issue, but we do know that everyone's experienced trauma, right? That's how widespread it is. So realizing the widespread expansion of trauma, absolutely. When we're looking at recognizing the signs and symptoms, so that's kind of our second foundational point in trauma-informed care. We want to know, what does this look like? So we know that everyone's been traumatized, but what does it look like when someone's really struggling with the impact of trauma? And to do that, I want to first start looking at trauma in the brain. When we experience trauma, it happens in the right side of our brain, which is the alarm portion. It does not logically sort things out and put all the puzzle pieces together and have it all nicely arranged, right? It is like there's an alarm going off and each component of that trauma is stored in a scattered way, almost like when you dump out the puzzle pieces to do a jigsaw puzzle in this big pile where kind of nothing makes sense. That's how trauma is working in the brain. So I actually have a video for you guys. It's called Trauma in the Brain, and it really looks at kind of what is happening for people when they're experiencing trauma and how we might talk to folks in light of that knowledge. Can you all see this screen? Cool.
Stephanie, I'm not sure if anybody else can hear it, but I cannot.
Oh no. Okay, I'm sorry.
I was waiting. I had sent you a message, but I'm not sure if anybody else can hear it either.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that. My gosh, we're so many minutes into it. So I'm going to stop the video since that is not great for folks. My chat box was not working on that, so I apologize. Basically, it is looking at how the alarm portion of the brain is the one that's reacting when someone's experiencing trauma. And because of that, that constant release of cortisol is how someone's brain can actually change from that experience of trauma. And it looks at how then people are taking on different traits to kind of deal with that. So we'll, I guess, keep moving forward. I apologize about that video. I can send the link to you all because it really is a worthwhile video. I'm going to skip past this poll since not a lot of people have been participating with that. But I do want to mention that when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, oftentimes we think of military vets as the group that is most likely to experience PTSD, right? We say, this person went to war. How could they not, right, come out impacted? Of course, they have trauma because they were being attacked. Well, in this particular study, they looked at these 6 groups of people, and they found that adult survivors of rape and sexual assault, adult survivors of DV, and child survivors of abuse were much more likely to experience PTSD. And when we think about that, we see that in the 3 bottom categories, the person that's causing the pain, that's causing the trauma, is the person that's supposed to actually also be in a loving relationship with people. I'm just getting some feedback, or, oh, I think it stopped, okay. And so when we think about it this way, right, that these components of PTSD are actually taken on to protect the self from additional trauma, it is a little bit, starts to make much more sense, right? So these defense mechanisms develop so that we can protect ourselves. Yet a lot of these things aren't necessarily easy to be around and certainly not comfortable for the person experiencing them. So I love this image about PTSD because it helps me kind of reframe for myself that when someone is presenting in this way, hey, this is just them saying, I have trauma, right? I'm doing this to help protect myself from trauma. And the more of these behaviors that I'm seeing, the more likely it is that this person has layers upon layers of trauma, right? And that when you reframe it in that way, right, it's not about what's wrong with you, it's about what happened to you, it is really helpful to the work. Because my next kind of question is, how does that trauma response, how might it get in the way of the work that you're all looking to do with them? So you can respond in the chat box, or you can respond through Poll Everywhere, and it'll show up right on the slide. But what are some ways that a client trauma response, right? Emotional numbing, rage, insomnia, avoidance. How might those things interfere with our ability to work with them? Anyone have a thought on how a client's trauma response might get in the way of the work that we do together? Yeah, lack of coping skills, absolutely. Lack of trust in the relationship, that's a huge one, right? Especially if the person that has violated or traumatized our clients is someone that was supposed to be in a trusting relationship. That is a huge component, and that also is reflective of how important it is for us to develop that trust in this trauma-informed care approach. Absolutely lack of social connections, inability to focus, those things can all make it feel like there's no hope for this client, right? Or there's no chance that they're going to get it. But instead of thinking about it that way, how can we develop our programs that the expectation is that people are navigating these symptoms? So the expectation is that people have this backpack of trauma that they're carrying around. And we can actually work to design our programs around that, right? So knowing it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. It's not that this person's trying to be difficult. It's not that they don't want to move forward. It's that perhaps all this trauma is getting in the way, and perhaps there are components of what we're doing that aren't really helpful to that. So that's where we get into our next piece of how do we respond in a way that resists re-traumatization? How can we take what we know about trauma and apply it to our programs and say, you know, these are things that we can do differently to make sure that we're thinking about this all the time? Because so many times the way that I see trauma happening is because it's just part of the policy, or this is the way we've always done things. So for example, in our court system, a survivor might have to retell their story 3 or 4 times just the night of the incident. And then again in front of the court, and then again to their attorney perhaps. And is there a way to minimize that? So here, one example is here at JBWS, we have the Family Justice Center, where that seeks to kind of consolidate how many times someone has to tell their story, so they're not continually doing that over and over again. Something like mandatory group attendance, you know, perhaps the topic of group that night is something that for me is going to be triggering. And so I don't want to go to group. And if it's mandated, then I'm just have no choice to be a part of that. Maybe I was triggered out in the community that day, and I would be better served to use that time to rest and recuperate. Mandatory group attendance, it comes from a good place, right? We have this information that is helpful to our clients, and we know that them having an opportunity to support each other in a group setting is really important. That's the thought behind it. But when we come from this trauma-informed approach, we have to say, well, is that really helping, right? Are there ways that when someone says, I don't want to go to group tonight, that it becomes a conversation of what's going on? Did something happen today? Or an opportunity for connection rather than just kind of, this is our policy, this is the way that we do things. Similarly, paperwork. One example at JBWS is there's a document called the Abusive Behavior Inventory. This document helps to really get a scope of the abuse that someone's experienced. It looks at the frequency of that and whether or not it's escalating. And it really is a great tool to be able to comprehensively understand someone's full picture of abuse. That being said, it used to be part of our policy that document would be completed within 2 weeks of someone coming into the safe house. And, you know, that document is looking at every single abusive behavior under the sun. And so some people are going to be triggered with memories that they had suppressed. It's just such a quick timeline, right? So the tool is good, but the way that we were implementing it, right, which was originally based on grants and looking at that timeline, we had to kind of advocate and say, this document with the timeline isn't useful, right? We need to reassess how we can use this tool in a way that's informed. So we did a couple things. We switched the order of it. So instead of starting with the most severe physical abuse, the tool starts with minimizing, denying, and blame, some of these like more nuanced controlling behaviors. And we also are a lot more flexible about the timeline for that, and how critical that is to their file, right? It's always going to be in light of the individual. Some people aren't triggered by doing this document. So it's always going to come back to, we're not going to just get rid of something because someone was re-traumatized by it, but we're going to really look at, let's think critically about how we're using this and whether or not, something that's intended to help is actually hurting. Well, that's not helpful, right? We have to reframe how we do it. Same with intake. I'm sure any of you that work in a residential program are familiar with bed bug treatments, but have, the first thing you do, come in and put all your clothes in the dryer on high, not so welcoming. So we can't change that, right? We have to make sure that there's no bed bugs in our residential program for the safety of everyone, but we have little welcome kits that we provide to families that have snacks and coloring and games for the kids and magazines and books for mom, things that help make it a little bit more welcoming, right? So that when someone is traumatized and on their way in and in this chaotic place, yes, we have to do the bed bug procedure, but it's an acknowledgement. Hey, we know that this isn't ideal, and we care about you and want to be supportive of you in, while you're getting this process done. Other ways that this might look is kind of labeling clients. It could be a schizophrenic or addict or battered woman. That doesn't ever feel good, and it dehumanizes a little bit. So really working to make sure that we're person first. It's also critical that clients have the ability to choose what program is correct for them and what treatment is correct for them. We know that from goal setting and buy-in that this makes sense, but when you're looking at trauma, when things feel out of control, it can be traumatizing. And so to build in opportunities for people to choose their outcomes or to choose their treatment is really helpful. And we would be remiss if we weren't seeking feedback from the people that we're working with, from our staff around the agency, on whether or not this is working. Did you feel supported? Did you feel that you could trust your worker? And again, it's not that we specifically don't want feedback from our clients, but are we building in avenues that they can regularly provide that, right? So someone doesn't have to go out of their way and talk to a manager about their experience. Every client fills out a survey, right? Every client is providing feedback, and that's driving then how we develop policy and how we examine the things that we do in our procedures around the agency. We can also find that the relationship can have a re-traumatizing impact. That component of trust that was identified before is so critical. And that doesn't, it doesn't mean you can't ever make a mistake, but being accountable if you make a mistake, treating clients with respect and dignity is critical. And especially, in DV work, the relationship is paramount, but I think in all work, the relationship is a critical component. And so building a trusting relationship is part of how we build emotional safety for clients. Also, this idea of doing things for rather than with, sometimes it is quicker to make the phone call for the client, or it is done from a place of wanting to help. But we really want to make sure that in that idea of treating clients with respect and dignity, this understanding that they're capable and competent to do things for themselves. We can be a support to them in that. And finally, the use of punitive treatment is always going to be re-traumatizing. And so let me give you an example from my agency is with when there's an intersection of substance abuse and domestic violence in our residential program. For example, if someone is in recovery and they slip, we know from our trauma-informed approach that that is normal and expected. And so how do we respond to that in a way that isn't punitive, that is supportive and acknowledges that substances are a way that lots of people cope with their trauma, right? When you think about that PTSD armor, emotional numbing was at the core. And so we can't have substances in our building, right? So we know that that's like a hard line that we can't have, but instead of kicking someone out, if we find substances, we're gonna engage them in a conversation on recovery and what support they need for that. And are they willing to work on that and continue in our program in that way? So yes, we can't have substances in our facility, but the way that we respond when we do have that happen has really become a lot more trauma informed. So in kind of this idea of like the model trauma informed approach, or this ideal, is that just as part of your core process as an agency, you're routinely screening for exposure to trauma and those symptoms. You're using culturally appropriate assessment and treatment for traumatic stress and the associated mental health symptoms. You're looking at the impact of that stress, that trauma and stress on someone's mental and physical well-being. You are working to strengthen and resilience and protective factors. You're addressing the trauma that parents, caregivers, and families have experienced, and you're maintaining an environment of care for staff. And that last piece is really critical, because one piece that we, I think, briefly mentioned is secondary trauma. So yes, witnessing a trauma is a traumatic event, but a lot of us in our helping roles are hearing about the trauma of those that we're working with regularly. And so that weighs on staff. And part of having a trauma-informed approach is understanding that staff are exposed to that secondary trauma. And so when we talk about parallel process, it's that the agency is responding in a trauma-informed way to its staff people, and the staff are responding in a trauma-informed way to the clients. And so this is like, wow, how do we get there, right? It's like a lot to get there, and really just bit by bit, figure out what needs to be done, then look at what can be done, and then you can build on that. One thing at a time happens, right? So looking at this idea of talking about your trauma, or having to retell the story, okay, that's triggering. Maybe we can utilize more body-mind approaches, right? Maybe we can have more art or music or dance or writing involved for our clients as part of their healing, as part of our trauma-informed approach. And then also having those things available for staff. So to break it down, I think a little bit further, we're going to go back to thinking about those core values of trauma-informed care. And so this image is from the University of Buffalo, which was one of the agencies that didn't have that 6th cultural component. But this is just kind of an example, right? So little things that we can start to do or look at and assess, are we doing these things? Every agency is going to have strengths and weaknesses as far as where they're trauma informed and where they need to bolster that trauma informed view. So, you know, your own agencies can kind of look at that, but these are just a couple examples. This idea that when someone comes in, they have the choice and control, right? These are your rights and responsibilities. This is the expectation of the program. This is what happens in that setting, right? If you are struggling, so that people don't have just this looming cloud of the what if and the unknown. This idea that people are involved in the planning and evaluating. We recently implemented client focus groups where we're getting feedback from them to help really update our policies and procedures. We also are doing focus groups with our volunteers, thinking about them as a group of our staff that we want to be hearing from and thinking about, right? Everyone's voice matters in this process. And so that really is, how do we build in avenues so that everyone's voice is heard? Trustworthiness, just treating people with respect and dignity, I think, is the most critical piece of this. And this idea that every interaction with an agency leaves people feeling positive and not re-traumatized. And this next kind of set of slides is taken from a handout from the Wisconsin Department of Health Services. It was a really cool spreadsheet that looks at how we implement these values in our agencies and how it's really critical that the organization is on this parallel wavelength with how staff are responding to clients. Staff can't respond to clients in a trauma-informed way if the agency isn't responding to them in a trauma-informed way, right? Again, thinking about secondary trauma, compassion fatigue. So when you're thinking about safety, yes, creating a warm and welcoming environment for clients, but also for staff. When we work with clients on creating a plan, well, are we working with our staff on creating a plan for the expected, right? It's expected that staff are going to be traumatized by some of the things that they hear from their clients, some of the things that they see happen to their clients within the systems. So how do we plan for that, right? And not it happens and then, oh my gosh, what's this? We know what's going to happen. So how can we build into our structure things that help people feel safer? When we look at trustworthiness, I think building on strengths, right? So praising successes, setting clear expectations, working with clients on just being consistent. I think that is one of the hardest things for trauma survivors is inconsistency. If I, for example, if I say, oh, I have an open door policy, please come in whenever. And that day I have I'm leading a webinar and I didn't remember to close my door and someone comes in and I say, oh, I'm busy right now. Well, that's not consistent or clear, right? I just potentially re-traumatize that person because I didn't kind of let them know what to expect. So it's just really about being mindful of the ways in which someone could be traumatized and kind of working in advance of that. Choice, again, this is focus groups that we've had for our clients, but the JBWS staff also is involved in the strategic planning for the agency. Everyone's voice matters. Everyone has an opportunity to provide feedback. And say what they want for professional development and how they want to move forward. With clients, there's not one size fits all. We know that we have to really be individualized and work with them on those specific plans, and the same goes for staff development. This I've been kind of reiterating over and over as the systematic ways to give feedback. This is really critical, again, because, I think specifically about the DV population, a lot of people's voices have been squashed. And so it is a way to ensure that someone who is hesitant to speak out or afraid to provide negative feedback has that arena. When we're talking about empowerment, with clients, sometimes we expect, for example, our Safe House is a 60-day program. Some clients are able to obtain safe permanent housing in those 60 days. Some clients are not. Everyone needs the space and time to make those necessary changes. And again, the same comes for the organization. Just watching one webinar on trauma-informed care doesn't mean that everything's changed and everyone's trauma-informed now. It's really a starting point or a moving forward point that we're committed to developing this within our community and within our agency, and we know that that's going to take time. And I love this piece about validating and addressing barriers. Sometimes when we set out a goal and we don't achieve it, it feels like a failure. And when we're able to reframe that as, well, these are the barriers, right? Let's hooray your successes. Let's shout that from the rooftop. And when there isn't a success or maybe a goal that's not achieved, well, let's look at what happened there. And yeah, there are things outside your control that impacted that. Having that validation is really freeing, right? From kind of pushing down on yourself this idea of not being supported. When I put this presentation together, I wanted to make sure that I was really giving you guys a comprehensive set of resources. So a lot of these have both just kind of definitions of trauma and trauma-informed care, but also toolkits, especially the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health has several toolkits. SAMHSA has toolkits on how you can do an assessment of how trauma-informed is my agency. What are some starting points? How can I create a plan to kind of start implementing this? And so all of these, I'll give you an example here. I think this one. So this tool for transformation, become accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed organizations. This toolkit is a free download and is really rich with a lot of information that can be helpful to agencies seeking to kind of set out on this path. And I'm gonna open it up for questions, but I just quickly want to plug in-service training. I'm a lot more engaging and dynamic in person than I am over a webinar. And some of you guys have had myself or people from my agency in to do training for your staff. It is free of charge for our community partners and looks at tons of different intersecting issues. If you go to JBWS.org, you can find a full list of our training programs. And so we really would love to be out in the community giving people information about how their agency might connect with domestic violence and how they can refer folks to JBWS. So now I want to kind of circle back and open it up for questions from people. I know we're ending a little bit early. That I do apologize about the video. I will send that link to Allison so that she can share it with you all. It's a great tool when we're thinking about how to be more trauma informed in our conversations with clients.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna step in real quick. Stephanie, you're a great presenter over webinar, but as someone who has had Stephanie at our agency, I can attest to how great she is in person as well. Just a reminder, some people had to come in a little bit late. We actually, I guess there was some kind of technical issue where some people couldn't get in. So we were joined maybe halfway through by a small group of people. So for those people who chimed in after we started, if you have a question, please enter it into the chat. And also if you called in late and you don't have like a name attached to your to how you signed in, if you could just go ahead and put your name in the chat as well, that would be really helpful to me so we can see who was in the presentation today. So again, if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask them now.
Thanks so much, Allison. Also, I just, as you said that, remembered that I meant to mention before the impact that trauma can have on health. There was a study that I came across just briefly in my research for this that looked at trauma actually being a negative indicator for medical outcomes for HIV positive clients. And so I just thought, you know, when we think about our mental and physical health, it really is so intertwined. And so, you know, when we see the ways that trauma interferes with our work with clients, it can also be interfering with just their health in general and their ability to reap benefit from the programs that they're engaged in. All right, well, if there aren't any questions, thank you everyone for attending. My contact info is on the first slide if anyone wants to get in touch that way to schedule a presentation, or if you think of a question later that you forgot to ask, you can feel free to reach out to me at klotz@jbws.org.
All right, thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you to everybody who joined the presentation today.
All right, thanks, Allison. I'm going to send that link for the video right away.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. It looked really interesting.
Okay, great. Thanks.